Monkey D. Luffy has been the main character of the best-selling comic series in the history of the world for over 25 years, and by almost every rule we use to measure a good main character, he fails. He does not drive his own story. He does not grow. He broke the world's most secure prison and set the worst humans alive loose on the planet, and the story has never really made him answer for it. He failed the most important test of his life at Marineford. His entire backstory was quietly rewritten into prophecy. He cannot even sit with his own grief without someone else doing it for him. And yet, One Piece has sold over 500 million copies, which means the question is not whether Luffy is a terrible protagonist. The question is how a terrible protagonist can carry the biggest story ever told. Tonight, slowly, quietly, we are going to answer that. Welcome to Anna Brain. Let's begin. The protagonist who never changes. There is a simple test you can run on almost any long story. Take the main character in the first chapter. Take the main character 1,000 chapters later. Put them side by side. Ask yourself, what is different? For most great stories, the answer is obvious. The character has learned things. They have lost things. They carry the weight of what happened to them along the way. You can see it in how they talk, how they think, how they decide what to do when something goes wrong. The person at the end is shaped by the road they walked. They are not the same person who started. Run this test on Monkey D. Luffy, and something strange happens. You can barely find a difference. One Piece started in July of 1997. The first chapter, called Romance Dawn, introduced a cheerful boy in a straw hat who declared, loudly and without any shame at all, that he was going to be the king of the pirates. He loved meat. He did not think about his choices before making them. He protected the people he liked and ignored almost everything else. He laughed a lot. He cried when his friends were hurt. His goals were simple, and his feelings were simple, and his answers to hard questions were almost always some version of, because I want to. Now jump forward. The manga has gone past chapter 1100. The anime has gone past episode 1100. Luffy has crossed oceans that killed better men. He has watched his older brother Ace die in his arms at Marineford. He has fought and beaten 4 of the strongest people in the world. He has been declared one of the 4 emperors, which is the highest rank a pirate can hold without actually finding the One Piece. He has eaten enough over the course of the series to feed a small country. And if you put chapter 1 Luffy next to chapter 1100 Luffy, the differences are almost entirely on the outside. He is stronger. He has new moves. His body can now do things it could not do before. But the person inside is the same. He still laughs at the same jokes. He still rushes into fights before anyone can stop him. He still says the same kinds of things in the same kinds of situations. He still doesn't think through his choices. He still wants meat. He still wants to be pirate king. He still has not really, truly, deep down where it matters, grown up. This is the thing almost every long-form critique of Luffy eventually lands on, and it is worth taking seriously. Fans on the official One Piece wiki discussion boards have been making this argument for years. The opening post of one of the most famous of these threads puts it plainly. The user lists out the issues. Luffy never takes things seriously. He doesn't understand most situations he walks into. He puts his crew in danger. He doesn't know when to leave. And above all, he doesn't learn. The user's final line is the one that stuck. What, they ask, is really the difference between Luffy of chapter 1 and Luffy of chapter 1000? It is a fair question, and once you start looking for the answer, you start to see how hard it is to give one. Compare Luffy to the other famous shonen main characters. Naruto Uzumaki starts Naruto as a loud, angry, lonely boy who wants to be Hokage so that people will finally notice him. By the end of his series, he is a husband, a father, and a village leader who has forgiven the people who tortured him and who understands that the world is more complicated than anyone told him when he was 12. He has not lost who he is. He is still loud. He is still stubborn. But the years have added something to him. The pain has stayed with him. He has been rearranged by his life. You can see the change. Ichigo Kurosaki from Bleach starts as a 15-year-old who can see ghosts and is angry about it. By the end, he has accepted the weight of what he is. He is quieter, heavier, more careful with the people he loves. He has been broken and put back together, and the cracks show. Goku from Dragon Ball starts as a child with a tail who has no idea what a human even is. By the end of Dragon Ball Z, he is a father, a husband, a grandfather, and someone who has died and come back and died again and come back again. He is still a kid at heart, but he is a kid at heart who has seen the planet end more than once, and some of that has stuck. Even Gon from Hunter x Hunter, who many people point to as a character who barely changes, ends up so broken by the end of his main arc that he physically transforms and almost dies from the weight of his own rage. His series is aware of his flaws. It pushes against them. It uses the story to pressure test his personality and show what happens when a boy like that meets a world that does not care about cheerful determination. Luffy does not get this. One Piece does not pressure test him in the same way. The world pushes, and Luffy pushes back. And at the end of the push, he is the same Luffy. The world has not reached inside him and rearranged the furniture. It has rearranged the house around him. him. There is a defense for this. It is not a bad one. Many fans argue that Luffy is what people call a static character. A static character is one whose job in a story is not to change, but to stay the same while everyone around them changes. A lighthouse, a fixed point. The argument goes that Luffy's purpose is to be a steady flame that other people light their torches from. Nami changes because of Luffy. Zoro changes because of Luffy. Vivi, Robin, Frankie, Jinbei, even entire islands. They all change because Luffy passed through. His job is not to grow. His job is to make growth possible for others. This is a real and honest way to read the character. But here is the problem with using it as a full defense. A static character can absolutely work beautifully, but the role of a static character is almost always a supporting one. The wise mentor who stays wise. The loyal friend who stays loyal. The idealist whose idealism survives every test because the story needs someone in it who will not bend. When you put a static character at the absolute center of a story this long, something starts to feel off. Because the main character is the one the audience is supposed to travel with, the one whose inner life we are supposed to share. If the inner life is not changing, if there is no new understanding, no new sorrow, no new wisdom being carried into the next arc, then the journey starts to feel a little bit one-sided. We are changing. The people around Luffy are changing. Luffy is not. And after 1,000 chapters, that gap becomes hard to ignore. The clearest place to see this is around the death of Ace. If any event in One Piece was built to change Luffy forever, it was that one. His older brother, his childhood hero, the person he had crossed oceans and broken into the world's most secure prison to save, died in his arms because Luffy was not strong enough to stop the blow. The series pauses. Luffy has a complete emotional breakdown. He cannot speak. He cannot breathe. Jinbei has to hold him down and remind him that he still has people left. It is one of the most moving sequences in the entire story. And then the time skip happens. 2 years pass. Luffy trains, the crew trains. When they come back together and set sail again, Luffy is effectively the old Luffy, goofier even, more playful, more reckless. The weight of losing Ace is referenced from time to time, but it does not live in his daily behavior. He does not carry his brother the way a person who loved someone that much usually carries them. He jokes the same way. He charges into battles the same way. He picks fights with Emperors of the Sea with the same cheerful lack of planning that got Ace killed in the first place. At one point in the Wano arc, Luffy meets a little girl named Otama, who has been waiting years for Ace to return, because Ace promised her he would come back. Luffy, without much care in his voice, tells her that Ace died 2 years ago. Otama is furious at him. She only understands later that Ace was Luffy's brother, because nothing in Luffy's face or voice told her that. He delivered the news like a weather report. That is not the behavior of a character who has been rewritten by loss. That is the behavior of a character whose story wants him unchanged. And the wider writing world has noticed this. Entertainment sites that cover One Piece closely have written pieces with titles like, "Luffy is regressing as a character." Other sites have argued that Luffy is the one thing about One Piece that has become less interesting over time, not more. Even inside the fandom, the debate about whether Luffy has developed at all is one of the most common arguments you can find. And the defenders of his development are often reduced to pointing at the fact that he is stronger now, or that he is slightly more willing to listen to Jinbei's advice, or that he refused to fight Big Mom once when it was smarter to retreat. These are real things, but they are small adjustments to a character who, at the level of his soul, is exactly who he was when he was 7 years old. This is a problem for a protagonist. Not a fatal one, maybe, not one the story cannot survive, but a real one. Because when the main character does not change, the story has to work twice as hard to convince you that it is going somewhere. The plot can move, the world can expand, the stakes can rise. But if the person at the center of it is not being shaped by any of this, then a quiet little question starts forming in the reader's mind. What is all of this for, if the one carrying it comes out the other side the same person who went in? Good stories usually answer this question by letting the hero grow. One Piece answers it by growing everything except the hero. And that brings us to the next thing. Because if Luffy is not the one being changed by his own story, if he is the fixed point and everyone else is the one moving, then you have to ask a harder question. A question that sounds almost disrespectful when you first ask it, but which opens up a lot once you do. Quote, _0__. Is Luffy actually the one driving this story forward at all? Or is he just the person the story happens to? Section 2. He does not drive the plot. He reacts to it. There is a simple idea buried in the word protagonist. The word comes from an old Greek term that basically means the first actor. The person who steps onto the stage and starts things. The one whose choices set the story in motion. A protagonist is not just the person the camera follows. A protagonist is the person who, by what they want and what they do, makes everything else in the story happen. This is the part of Luffy that falls apart when you look at it closely. Luffy wants to be Pirate King. He has wanted this since he was a child. He says it constantly. He says it to friends, to enemies, to strangers he met 5 seconds ago. It is the single clearest goal in maybe any long-running series, and he has never wavered from it for one panel of the manga. But here is the strange thing. Across more than 1,000 chapters, Luffy has almost never taken a direct action to move toward that goal. He is not actively hunting the One Piece. He is not studying the map of the Grand Line the way a treasure hunter would. He is not collecting the clues that lead to Laugh Tale, the final island where the treasure lies, through any plan of his own. He is not interrogating prisoners. He is not paying for information. He is not making deals with people who know things he needs to know. He is just sailing and eating and sleeping and landing on whatever island the ocean currents push his ship toward next. This is not an insult to the character. It is just a fact about how One Piece is built. Luffy does not search for the One Piece. The One Piece is out there somewhere, and the story is slowly dragging him toward it, one arc at a time. The thing that the main character wants more than anything in the world is the thing he is putting almost zero deliberate effort into actually getting. Compare this to almost any other adventure story you can name. In Lord of the Rings, Frodo Baggins has one job, which is to carry the ring to Mount Doom, and every choice he makes is in service of that goal. In Attack on Titan, Eren Yeager has one job, which is to find out what is in that basement, and he will tear down mountains to do it. Even in other shonen stories, the main character usually has an active hunt. Gon is looking for his father. Naruto is trying to become Hokage through specific missions he takes on. Edward Elric in Full Metal Alchemist is literally traveling to find a specific stone. These characters have a direction. They move toward the thing they want. Luffy does not move toward the thing he wants. He moves, and the thing he wants is eventually somewhere ahead of him on the current. Now, a reasonable person might push back here. They might say, but Luffy does act. He fights. He fights harder than almost any character in any story ever written. And that is true. Luffy acts constantly. What he almost never does is act first. This is the pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Look at the first big arc in the East Blue, the Arlong Park arc. This is the story everyone points to as the moment One Piece got serious, the moment the series found its voice. And the way that arc begins is that Nami, Luffy's navigator, goes back to the village where she grew up, and Luffy follows her. He finds out that the village has been ruled for years by a cruel fishman named Arlong, who has been taxing the villagers into misery and forcing Nami to work for him to buy back her home. Nami breaks down in front of Luffy. She asks for his help. Only then does Luffy fight. He does not show up at Kokoyashi village on his own. He does not investigate Arlong because Arlong is evil. He goes because his friend asked him to, and because his friend is sad. If Nami had never told him the story, if she had never begged, Luffy would have sailed right past her entire home island without ever knowing a tyrant was ruling it. Now look at Alabasta, the arc after that. The Straw Hats get pulled into a countrywide civil war that has been brewing for years. The way they get pulled in is that they meet a princess named Vivi, who is trying to stop the war alone. Vivi joins the crew. Vivi tells them what is happening. Luffy agrees to help her protect her country, and he fights Crocodile, who is one of the strongest villains in the East Blue and Paradise half of the series. Not because Crocodile is a terrible person poisoning a nation, but because Vivi is his friend, and she is hurting. If Vivi had never boarded their ship, the kingdom of Alabasta could have burned to the ground, and Luffy would not have cared. He would not have even known. This is not a one-time thing. Look at Enies Lobby, the arc many fans call the best in the entire series. Nico Robin, Luffy's archaeologist, is kidnapped by the world government. The Straw Hats storm one of the most heavily defended islands in the entire world to get her back. They declare war on the world government itself. The arc ends with Luffy's crew burning the flag of the world government in front of the whole world, which is the single most symbolic act of rebellion in the entire series up to that point. And why did this happen? Because Robin was taken. That is the entire reason. Luffy did not wake up one morning and decide to fight the world government because it was corrupt. The world government crossed him, and so he crossed it back. Everything that happens in Enies Lobby is reactive. Even the iconic moment where the Straw Hats burn the flag is Luffy responding to an order Robin needed to hear, that they would take on the whole world to save her. Skip forward all the way to Whole Cake Island. Hundreds of episodes later, Sanji, the cook, is pulled back to his home family, the Vinsmokes, for an arranged political marriage with a daughter of Big Mom, who is one of the 4 emperors of the sea. Luffy chases after him. He does not chase because he has a plan to defeat Big Mom. He does not chase because he wants the territory. He chases because his cook, his friend, is in trouble. The pattern repeats and repeats. Wano, the longest arc in the series, begins because Luffy wants to help Law, and because a little girl named Otama needed food, and because the samurai Kinemon asked for the crew's help. Dressrosa begins because Law asks Luffy to join a plan. Fishman Island begins because the crew needs to pass through it on the way to the New World. Thriller Bark begins because a ship appears in the fog. Skypiea begins because a map falls out of the sky, and Luffy thinks Sky Islands sound cool. Even that last one, which seems like a real choice, Luffy deciding to chase an adventure on his own, is not really a choice in the way we usually mean the word. It is a whim. He sees a thing, he thinks it sounds fun, he follows it. That is different different from a decision. A decision is when you have multiple options and you pick one for a reason that connects to your bigger plan. A whim is when the world dangles something shiny in front of you and you walk toward it without thinking. Luffy runs on whims. The story puts the shiny thing in front of him and he chases it, and then the shiny thing turns out to be the next arc. A character analysis posted on an online forum a few years back summed this up with a line that is worth sitting with. The writer argued that Luffy does not really make hard decisions, he just takes action. Whatever choice has the most cheerful, most hopeful outcome, Luffy takes without thinking about the rest. The only truly hard decision Luffy ever made, the writer argued, was telling Usopp to leave the crew during the Water 7 arc. And he only made that decision because he was backed into a corner by his own words and could not walk it back. That is a striking claim. And once you test it, it holds up better than you would expect. Try to think of a moment in One Piece where Luffy sat with two real choices, weighed them carefully, and picked the harder one because it was right. You will be searching for a while. He reacts fast. He reacts loudly. He almost never chooses the way a protagonist is supposed to choose. A protagonist chooses. That is the thing that defines them. Frodo chooses to take the ring. Harry Potter chooses to walk into the forest at the end of his story. Katniss chooses to volunteer. These are moments where the character could have done something else, and they did not, and that choice changes everything. Luffy rarely gets these moments because he rarely stops long enough to see the other option. He just runs at what is in front of him. You can argue this is part of his charm. You can argue that this is exactly what makes him a different kind of hero, and that the world of One Piece is better for having a protagonist who acts from his heart rather than from strategy. That is a fair reading. It is probably the reading Ichiro Oda, the creator of One Piece, would give you. Luffy is not supposed to be a tactician. He is supposed to be a force of nature, a rubber boy who cannot be stopped, a person whose simplicity is his strength. But the cost of writing a character this way is real, and it is worth being honest about. When your protagonist does not drive the plot, you have to drive the plot from the outside, which means you, as the writer, have to keep inventing new islands, new tyrants, new political situations, new friends in trouble, new reasons for the main character to fight. You have to manufacture the story's forward motion because the main character is not generating any of his own. And this creates a pattern in One Piece that many longtime readers have complained about. Every island the Straw Hats land on has a crisis. Every island has a tyrant. Every island has a good person who needs saving. Every arc ends the same way. The reason is not that Oda is a lazy writer. Oda is a genius. The reason is structural. When your main character only moves when something is pulling him, you have to put something pulling him on every island or the story stops. A protagonist who drives the plot can go to a peaceful island and still create a story there because his desires will create conflict. A protagonist who reacts to the plot needs the island to hand him the conflict on arrival or nothing happens. So Luffy arrives, and Luffy is handed a friend, and the friend is in trouble, and the friend's trouble is the next arc. And Luffy fights, because of course he does, because the friend is in trouble, and that is what Luffy fights for. He is not a first actor. He is a responder. He is someone things happen to, not someone who makes things happen. And this changes the whole feel of the story once you notice it. It changes what kind of hero Luffy actually is. It changes whose story One Piece really is. Because if the main character is not pushing the plot, then somebody must be. And it is worth asking who. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. It changes something else too. Something quieter and maybe more troubling. Because if a protagonist acts only when the people he loves are hurt, and is almost entirely indifferent to the suffering of strangers he has not yet met, then the question of what Luffy actually believes, not what he feels in the moment, but what he actually stands for, starts to get a lot harder to answer than most fans would like to admit. Section 3. The morality that isn't a morality. People describe Luffy as a good person. They say this constantly. In fan discussions, in reviews, in video essays, in casual conversation. Luffy is good. Luffy is kind. Luffy has a strong heart. Luffy is the moral center of One Piece. And when you watch the show, it is easy to see why people feel this way. Luffy protects the weak. He refuses to stand by while cruel people hurt innocent ones. He gives his food to hungry children. He cries when his friends cry. He laughs when his friends laugh. The music swells. The animation glows. You watch a scene where Luffy punches a slave trader in the face and you feel in your gut that this is a good person doing a good thing. Now pause. Step back. Ask a quieter question. What does Luffy actually believe? Not how does he feel in the moment. Not who is he kind to. Not what does he fight for when a friend is bleeding in front of him. Ask instead what rules Luffy lives by. What lines he will not cross. What principles guide his choices when the choices get hard. The honest answer is that he does not really have any. What he has is something different, and it is worth naming clearly. Luffy has attachments. He has people he loves, and he fights for the people he loves. That is the entire shape of his moral world. Outside of the people he is personally attached to, the world could be burning, and Luffy would, at best, rest, notice it in passing, and go eat some meat. This is not a mean reading of the character. It is the reading the story itself provides, over and over, for anyone willing to pay attention. The earliest and clearest version of this comes in the Syrup Village arc, very near the beginning of One Piece. Captain Kuro, a villain planning to murder his way through a small village to inherit a rich girl's fortune, meets Luffy and asks him a question that the series has never truly answered. Kuro asks Luffy why he is fighting so hard to save a village he has no real connection to. Luffy has been here for a handful of days. He does not know these people. He has no history with them. Luffy's answer is striking in how simple it is. He says there is someone in this village he does not want Kuro to kill. That is it. That is the whole reason. Not because the village deserves to be saved. Not because murder is wrong. Not because the plan Kuro is about to carry out is cruel and cowardly. Because one person he happens to like lives there, and that one person matters to him. Now, you can watch that scene and feel only warmth. The loyalty is genuine. The fierce protectiveness is real. But ask yourself the sharper question. If Luffy had not met Usopp in Syrup Village, if Usopp had been on the other side of the island, if Luffy had simply sailed past without ever stepping on shore, would Kuro have been stopped? Would the village have been saved? Would Luffy have cared at all? The answer the story gives you, if you are honest with yourself, is no. The same test works on almost every arc in One Piece. Take Alabasta. The kingdom is in the middle of a civil war. Thousands of people are about to die. The entire country is being manipulated by one man for his own gain. This is exactly the kind of massive, continent-wide injustice that a heroic protagonist should, by every classic definition of heroism, feel obligated to stop. But Luffy does not go to Alabasta to stop a civil war. He goes because Princess Vivi, a girl he met on his ship, is his friend, and she is crying. If Vivi had never snuck aboard the Going Merry, if Luffy had never gotten to know her, if the dice of the story had rolled slightly differently and he had simply passed through Alabasta waters on his way somewhere else, nothing about that country's collapse would have mattered to him. The writer of a thoughtful character analysis posted online a few years back called this out directly. The author argued that Luffy does not travel from island to island trying to make things right. He shows up where he happens to show up, he befriends whoever happens to be nearby, and if that nearby friend has a problem he can solve, he solves it. The country is incidental. The stakes are incidental. The injustice is incidental. The friend is everything. This means Luffy's heroism, which looks on the surface like the broadest possible kind of heroism, is actually one of the narrowest kinds there is. He is not fighting for the oppressed. He is fighting for his oppressed friend, or for his friend's oppressed family, or for a stranger his friend cares about. The circle is small. The people outside the circle are not really on his radar. You can see this even more clearly if you look at the moments where Luffy openly says it out loud. During the Fishman Island arc, after Luffy has beaten a massive villain and freed a huge undersea kingdom, Jinbei, the wise, kind fisherman who will eventually join his crew, tells Luffy something complimentary. He calls Luffy a hero. He says that Luffy has saved Fishman Island and that its people will remember him as a hero forever. Luffy rejects this directly, immediately. He says he is not a hero because a hero would share his meat with everyone, and Luffy does not want to share his meat. He wants to eat his own meat. He laughs while he says it. Most fans read this moment as a joke, a funny, humble little line that shows Luffy does not take himself too seriously. But read it literally for a second. A hero, in Luffy's own words, is someone who shares with everyone. Luffy does not want to do that. Luffy wants to keep what is his and protect who is his. That is not a joke. That is a clear-eyed statement of his actual worldview, delivered in the goofiest possible way so that it slides past most of the audience without being heard. He is telling you directly that he is not here to save the world. He is here to eat his meat and take care of his people. Anything else is a side effect. And now we have to talk about the moment that breaks the heroic reading of Luffy completely. The moment most loyal fans skate past because it is uncomfortable. The Impel Down arc. When Luffy learns that Ace is going to be executed, he decides to break into the world's most secure prison to save him. Impel Down is not a normal prison. It is a stack of underground levels designed to hold the most dangerous, most violent, most vicious criminals in the entire world. People whose crimes were so terrible that the world government buried them here and pretended they no longer existed. Murderers, tyrants, monsters. The kind of people Impel Down was built to contain precisely so that the rest of the world could sleep at night. Luffy breaks in, and in the process of trying to reach his brother, he ends up touching off the first and only mass escape in the history of the prison. Hundreds of prisoners get free. These are not misunderstood people. These are not political prisoners being held unjustly. These are the worst human beings the One Piece world has ever produced. And they are now on ships, heading back to the surface, back to the islands, back to the towns and villages that the world government had spent years trying to keep them away from. At one point during the breakout, a prison guard named Hanya Ball, who is kind of a buffoon for most of the arc, gives a speech that lands heavier than almost anything else in that storyline. Hanya Ball tells Luffy that Impel Down exists to protect ordinary people from evil pirates. He says that if this prison falls, the world itself will plunge into darkness. He is not wrong. The prison is full of people who, once released, will absolutely cause terrible harm to innocent civilians who had nothing to do with any of this. And Luffy's response to this speech is extraordinary if you let it land. Luffy does not try to argue with Hannibal. He does not say the prisoners deserve mercy. He does not claim that the world government is wrong about who belongs here. He does not defend his actions in any moral sense at all. What he says, essentially, is that Ace is important to him, and so Hannibal needs to move out of his way. Let that sit for a second. A man in his path has just told Luffy that releasing these prisoners will cause terrible harm to countless strangers. And Luffy's answer is, I do not care, because my brother is the one I love. Move. This is not a neutral moment. This is not, as some fans argue, simply Luffy being single-minded in a cool way. This is the protagonist of a massive, beloved, culturally important story openly saying that the suffering of strangers does not weigh as much on him as the life of one person he is related to. It is a completely understandable human emotion, but it is not the emotion of a moral hero. It is the emotion of someone with a very small circle and a very large indifference to everything outside it. Among the prisoners who escaped Impel Down during that breakout were 5 men who went on to become the core of the Blackbeard Pirates. Sandwan Wolf, the Giant, Shiryu, the former chief guard turned killer, Avalo Pizarro, Vasco Shot, and Katarina Devon. These 5 would go on to help Blackbeard, who is shaping up to be the final villain of the entire One Piece story, become one of the most dangerous forces in the world. Every terrible thing Blackbeard does from here until the end of the series, he does with a crew that was made possible by Luffy's breakout at Impel Down. A thoughtful online essay on One Piece morality a few years back used a sharp phrase to describe this. The writer said Luffy's dream is a noble one, but Luffy is willing to plunge the world into fear and chaos to chase it. The author pointed out that Luffy is undeniably selfish and often does not think about or care about what happens to people he does not know personally. The essay's conclusion was not that Luffy is a villain. It was something harder to argue with. Luffy has never really been out to save the world. He saves islands along the way, sometimes when they happen to be in his path, and when the pain on them touches someone he already cares about. This is a very different kind of character than the hero most fans describe. It is not a bad character. It is a vivid one. It is a character with a real, specific, understandable inner life. But it is not a moral one, in the way most protagonists of famous stories are moral. It is personal. Warm, yes. Kind, yes. Loyal, yes. Principled, no. And this gap, once you see it, changes how you read almost every arc in One Piece. The celebratory moments where Luffy frees a country, the cheering crowds, the tears of grateful villagers, the music swelling as a tyrant falls. These moments are real, and they are earned, in the sense that Luffy did the thing that made them possible. But the inner reason Luffy did the thing was almost never about the country, or the crowd, or the villagers. It was about one person he knew, whose pain he happened to be close to. The country was saved accidentally, as a byproduct of Luffy's love for someone he had met a few weeks earlier. That is a strange kind of hero. It is not a fake hero, but it is a hero who would not pick up his fists if the one person he loved was not in the room. Which means the entire heroic reading of Luffy depends, every single time, on the lucky accident that the right friend was standing in the right place at the right moment. Take the friend out of the picture, and Luffy walks past. And when a character's heroism lives or dies on whether a particular person happens to be nearby, you have to start asking bigger, harder questions about that character. You have to ask what it means that the protagonist of the biggest pirate story ever told has never once fought a villain, because the villain was evil on his own merits. You have to ask what the story itself is actually celebrating when it celebrates Luffy. Quote _2__. And you have to ask one more thing, which is the hardest question of all. Because if Luffy's moral world is this small, and his care is this personal, and his fights are this reactive, then the moments in the series where his choices caused truly massive, world-altering damage to strangers he would never meet must count for something. They must sit somewhere in the ledger. And the ledger, it turns out, is longer and darker than most fans want to admit, because there is one prison break in particular where the cost of Luffy's choices did not stay inside the prison walls. Section 4, Impel Down, or the cost of Luffy's decisions to the world. There are moments in long stories where you can feel the writer placing something quietly into the foundation of the world, something that is going to matter later, something that the story is not ready to deal with yet, but is not willing to pretend did not happen. Impel Down is one of those moments, and what the story placed in the foundation during that arc is not going to come back as a small echo. It is going to come back as the ending of the whole series. Let us walk through what actually happened, slowly, because the scale of it matters. Luffy's older brother Ace had been captured by the pirate Blackbeard and handed over to the world government. The government announced that Ace would be publicly executed at Marineford, the headquarters of the Marines, in a a few days. The purpose of the public execution was to bait Whitebeard, one of the 4 emperors of the sea, into a war the government planned to win. Luffy, upon hearing this, decided to go save his brother. The problem was that Ace was not at Marineford yet. Ace was still being held at Impel Down, the underwater prison that the world government had built specifically to contain the pirates who were too dangerous to leave alive on the surface. So Luffy's plan, if you can call it a plan, was to break into Impel Down, find Ace, and get him out before Ace could be moved. Impel Down is worth understanding properly, because the whole weight of this arc depends on understanding what kind of place Luffy chose to break into. Impel Down is not a regular prison. It is a massive underwater tower, built upside down, with 6 floors descending into hell. The top floor holds the least dangerous prisoners. The next floor holds worse ones, and the floors keep getting worse until you reach level 6, the bottom, which is called the Eternal Hell. Level 6 holds the prisoners whose crimes were so terrible that the world government has officially erased them from history. These are people whose existence the world does not even remember, locked away forever because if they ever got out, the scale of the damage would be enormous. This is the prison Luffy chose to break into, and the word chose is doing a lot of work here. Luffy knew what Impel Down was. He knew what lived inside it. He knew that the levels below him contained people who had been buried down there for good reason, and he did not hesitate for even a moment. He simply went. The way he went is worth pausing on too. Luffy did not sneak in. He did not try to extract Ace quietly. He did not plan around the security. He punched through the front. He fought the guards. He smashed through cells. He tore through the prison's entire safety system on his way down. Every step he took made the place more unstable. Every fight he picked opened up more gaps. And then something happened that, on a first read, feels like a lucky break for Luffy. As he was smashing his way through, he started picking up allies. He freed a man named Mr. Two Bon Clay, a villain from an earlier arc who now adored Luffy. He freed Mr. 3, who had tried to kill him in the past. He freed Sir Crocodile, a former enemy who had literally tried to conquer an entire country. He freed Buggy the Clown, an old rival. He freed a man named Emporio Ivankov, who had been hiding in a secret floor between levels 5 and 6. Ivankov had an army of his own followers called the Newcomers, who joined Luffy too. These are, let us be clear, not heroic people. Crocodile had tried to start a civil war in Alabasta to seize the country's ancient weapon. Mr. 3 had tried to kill Luffy and his friends. Buggy had tried to murder a child. These men were in Impel Down because the world had decided, by reasonable standards, that they should not be free. Luffy let them out, not by accident, on purpose. He needed an army to help him break back out of the prison, and the army he assembled was the army the prison existed to hold in. Meanwhile, something else was happening at the surface of Impel Down, something the story shows Luffy completely missing, because Luffy is focused only on Ace. The pirate Blackbeard had arrived. Blackbeard had just recently become one of the 7 warlords of the sea, a ceremonial title that gave him free access to places like Impel Down. Blackbeard knew exactly what was locked in the Eternal Hell. He had been planning for this for years, and when Luffy's breakout started, the guards were so busy chasing Luffy through the upper levels that almost no one was watching the bottom floor. Blackbeard walked right in, descended to level 6, and handpicked the worst of the worst to recruit into his crew. He took San Juan Wolf, a giant so massive that his body could not fit inside the prison's cells without bending impossibly. Shiryu, the former chief guard of the prison who had turned into a killer and been locked in his own prison. Avalo Pizarro, a former king who had committed crimes so extreme that his noble title was stripped from him. Vasco Shot, a monster of a drinker who had destroyed entire settlements. And Katarina Devon, a woman whose crimes had been erased from the record. These 5 became the core of the Blackbeard Pirates, the crew that, by the time you reach the final arcs of One Piece, is shaping up to be the most dangerous force in the world. Luffy did not notice any of this at the time. He had a brief encounter with Blackbeard during the breakout. Blackbeard noticed that Luffy's strength had grown. He told Luffy about Skypiea and teased him about the existence of the One Piece. Then he let Luffy go, and Luffy let him go, and both of them returned to what they were actually focused on. Luffy was focused on Ace. Blackbeard was focused on building his crew. They walked past each other in the stairwell, and the world tilted, and Luffy did not notice because his attention was somewhere else. This is the moment. If you want the single clearest picture of what it means to have a main character whose moral world is limited to the people he personally loves, this is it. Luffy was inside the prison while the worst human beings alive were walking out of it, with a man who was actively planning to conquer the world, and Luffy's eyes were on one person. Now, a defender of Luffy might say, reasonably, that he could not have stopped Blackbeard even if he had tried. And that is probably true. Luffy was not strong enough at that point to beat Blackbeard. But the argument is not about whether Luffy could have physically prevented the escape. The argument is about whether Luffy ever stopped to care about it. And the answer, across the entire arc and every arc that comes after, is that he did not. The escape of the level 6 prisoners is mentioned later in the story as a historical fact, but Luffy himself never carries the weight of it. He does not apologize for it. He does not agonize about it. He does not spend a single chapter privately wrestling with what he set loose into the world. When the guard Hannibal tried to stop Luffy during the breakout and gave his desperate speech about Impel Down being the wall between ordinary people and the monsters it held, Luffy's response was effectively, "My brother is more important. Move." Hannibal was not being dramatic. He was describing, correctly, the actual function of the prison. Impel Down existed because the world had decided that certain people could not be allowed to walk freely among everyone else. That decision was not abstract. It was the result of those people having already done enormous harm. The prison was the world's answer to the question of what to do with human beings whose cruelty could not be trusted anywhere but underground. Luffy disagreed with that answer for the duration of one arc because his brother was inside the same building, and the cost of that disagreement did not stop at the prison walls. This is the part the story quietly lets sit for hundreds of chapters. Blackbeard's crew, built out of Impel Down's worst, went on to do terrible things. They interrupted the battle at Marineford. They took Whitebeard's dying body and, in the chaos, stole the power of his devil fruit, which should not have been possible. They grew stronger. They raided islands. They added more members. By the time Luffy reaches the final saga of the story, the Blackbeard pirates are one of the central threats to the entire world, and every one of them owes their freedom, directly or indirectly, to what Luffy did in that prison. A thoughtful fan essay that went around the internet a while back made the point cleanly. The writer said that Luffy's goal is a noble one, but Luffy was willing to plunge the world into fear and chaos in order to save Ace. The writer noted that hundreds of violent, murderous criminals would indiscriminately hurt, rob, and kill civilians the moment they got back to the surface, and that Luffy knew this, and that Luffy accepted this as a price. The word accepted is important. This was not a mistake. It was not an accident. Luffy made a trade. He traded the safety of an enormous number of strangers for the life of his brother, and the trade did not even work. Ace died anyway a few days later, which means the suffering Luffy loosed on the world to save him was, in the end, a debt paid for nothing. The story is not subtle about how many terrible things the escaped prisoners go on to do. Crocodile immediately rejoins the new world and becomes a force of chaos. Buggy absurdly becomes a warlord himself, then eventually an emperor, an elevation that can be traced directly back to the reputation he gained from surviving the Impel Down breakout. Ivankov takes his newcomers and bolsters the revolutionary army, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but which represents a massive redistribution of power that the world government did not agree to. And Blackbeard's crew keeps growing. Every one of these changes to the global balance of power happened because Luffy broke into a prison to save one person. This is what it looks like when a protagonist's moral world is this narrow. When the circle of people you care about is small, and your willingness to fight for them is infinite, the math starts getting very strange. You will burn a forest down to save one tree. You will let a city drown to keep one friend dry. You will free the worst humans alive if doing so gives you even a chance at reaching your brother in time. And from the inside, from Luffy's point of view, this all makes perfect sense, because the value of Ace is infinite, and the value of the strangers is not something he has ever bothered to measure. This is where the heroic reading of Luffy breaks hardest. A hero, in the classic sense, is someone who weighs the costs of their choices on everyone those choices will touch, and tries to choose the option with the least total harm. Luffy does not do this. Luffy weighs the cost of a choice on the people he personally loves, and everything else falls outside the scale. It is worth saying that the story knows this. The story shows you, without flinching, that Luffy's choice at Impel Down has consequences. It is not covered up. It is not forgotten. It is, instead, one of the quiet central pillars of everything that comes after. The Blackbeard crew that haunts the final arcs was assembled because of Luffy. The Buggy Emperor storyline that plays out in the final saga exists because of Luffy. The sheer scale of the villainy the Straw Hats are going to have to face at the end of this story was, in significant part, built by Luffy's own hands when he tore Impel Down apart. So the protagonist of One Piece is, in one of the most important ways a protagonist can be measured, responsible for a meaningful fraction of the evil in his own world. This is not the framing most viewers carry with them when they think about Luffy. Most viewers carry the cheerful boy, the rubber arms, the stretchy grin, but the cheerful boy walked through a prison full of the worst humans alive and left the doors open behind him. That is not a detail. That is a fact the story has been living inside for hundreds of chapters. Quote 3 and the really painful part, the part that turns Impel Down from a dark footnote into something heavier, is that the whole thing did not even work. Luffy broke the prison. Luffy freed the monsters. Luffy marched toward Marineford with an army of criminals behind him and a sick feeling in his chest and a brother he was convinced he could still save. And when he got to Marineford, with all of this behind him, the thing he had done all of it for did not happen. Ace did not come home. The war that followed did not end in a way that felt like anything except loss. And Luffy, for the first time in the entire series, had to sit inside the question of what it means to do something huge and terrible and have none of it matter. Section 5. Marineford, or a protagonist who couldn't save anyone. Every long story has one moment that the writer has been building toward from the very first chapter. The moment that is supposed to prove the main character. The moment that tells the audience, finally, what this whole long journey has actually been about. In Lord of the Rings, it is the cracks of Mount Doom. In Attack on Titan, it is the basement. In Naruto, it is the valley. In One Piece, for the first half of the story, that moment was Marineford. Everything that came before, the East Blue, the Grand Line, Alabasta, Skypiea, Water 7, Thriller Bark, Sabaody, Impel Down, was building to the war. The Summit War of Marineford, as it is officially called, is the largest battle in One Piece up to that point. It is the moment where the Marines, the Warlords, the Whitebeard Pirates, the Revolutionary Army, and Luffy himself all collided in one place. It is the moment the whole balance of the world was supposed to be decided. And it is, by almost any honest reading, Luffy's most complete failure. Let us walk through what happens because the details matter, and because most fans remember this arc through the emotional highlights rather than the actual outcome. Luffy arrives at Marineford after his destructive breakout from Impel Down. He has brought with him an army of the worst criminals alive. He has broken a prison that existed for good reason. He has set the stage for decades of damage to the outside world. And he has done all of this for one purpose: to save his brother Ace from public execution. Ace is already on the platform when Luffy gets there. The executioners are in position. The crowd, made up of Marines and pirates locked in battle, is screaming around him. Whitebeard, the strongest man in the world and the captain of Ace's crew, has already arrived and is fighting a desperate war to free his son. The Whitebeard pirates and their allies have come in force. Dozens of ships, hundreds of pirates, many of them men and women who had nothing to do with Ace personally, but who followed Whitebeard without question, because Whitebeard had told them that Ace mattered. The war that is happening around Luffy was started by Whitebeard. The rescue attempt that is in motion was planned and executed by Whitebeard's crew. The manpower that is breaking through the marine defenses is Whitebeard's army. The political weight that made this entire battle possible was Whitebeard's weight. Luffy is a small, rubber, loud piece of chaos, adding himself to a war that was already being fought by a man who loved Ace more than he loved his own life. And here's the thing that is easy to miss. Luffy does not save Ace. Whitebeard saves Ace. Or rather, Whitebeard creates the conditions under which Ace is saved. Luffy is the one who makes it up the platform, who uses his rubber abilities to stretch across the battlefield, who finally reaches his brother and breaks his chains using a key that was handed to him by Boa Hancock. The moment of the actual unchaining is Luffy's moment, absolutely. But the moment was only made possible because thousands of other people fought and bled and died around him to keep the path clear. Luffy on his own would have been cut down by the Marines in the first 5 minutes. The reason he survived long enough to reach Ace is that Whitebeard, Jinbei, Ivankov, Crocodile, Mr. 3, the Whitebeard commanders, and a long list of other pirates kept him alive by taking blows meant for him. Every step Luffy took up that platform was a step somebody else paid for in blood. Then Ace is free. Luffy has done the thing. The brothers are reunited. The cameras would usually fade out here in a lesser story, on a moment of victory. Marineford does not let you have that moment, because what happens next is that the escape begins, and during the escape, Admiral Akainu of the Marines insults Whitebeard in front of Ace. And Ace, instead of continuing to run with his brother, stops, turns, and goes back to fight Akainu, who is a man Ace cannot beat. Akainu is one of the 3 strongest Marines alive, the wielder of the magma fruit, and in terms of raw power, he is in a league Ace is not ready for. Ace knows this. Luffy knows this. Everyone watching knows this. But Ace, who has spent his whole life wrestling with shame over being the son of the Pirate King, and with a terrible need to be recognized as someone worth something, cannot let the insult to Whitebeard stand. Ace turns back. Ace attacks Akainu. Akainu counters the attack, and in the moment that Akainu swings his magma fist at Luffy to kill him, Ace steps in the way. Akainu's fist goes through Ace's chest. Ace dies in Luffy's arms. He dies looking up at his little brother, thanking him for loving him, telling him to take care of the others, and asking him to pass a message to the Whitebeard pirates. He says that even though he was unwanted from birth, being loved by them was the greatest gift of his life. And then he is gone. This is the moment the series has been building to. This is the moment that was supposed to be the protagonist's hour. And watch what happens to Luffy in this moment, because the way he behaves in the aftermath is one of the most revealing sequences in the entire series. Luffy does not fight Akainu. He cannot. He is already broken. He stares down at his brother's body. His face goes slack. His eyes go empty. He stops hearing the war around him. Jinbei has to grab him and physically carry him away from the battlefield because Luffy has become, in the space of a few seconds, functionally unable to move on his own. He is dragged from Marineford. He survives because other people kept him alive during his breakdown. Then Whitebeard dies. Whitebeard, the man who brought the war, who fought Akainu to avenge Ace, who stood alone against the full force of the Marines to let his children escape, is killed by Blackbeard's crew in the final hours of the battle. And Whitebeard's final words, spoken into a world the whole globe was watching through newspaper transmissions, are that the One Piece is real, that it exists, that somewhere out on the Grand Line, the greatest treasure in the world is waiting for whoever can find it. With those words, Whitebeard did what decades of pirate hunters and marine admirals had failed to do. He triggered a new golden age of piracy. Every young person with dreams and nothing to lose heard those words and set out to sea. The seas filled with new pirates. The Marines were stretched thin. The carefully maintained balance of world power that Whitebeard himself had helped hold in place collapsed the moment he died. None of this is Luffy's doing in a direct sense. Whitebeard made his own choice to stay behind. Akainu made his own choice to insult Whitebeard. Ace made his own choice to turn back. But Luffy was the reason the situation existed in which all of these choices had to be made. Luffy's insistence on breaking into Impel Down, his insistence on reaching Marineford, his insistence on being there for Ace, created the stage on which the war played out. Whitebeard would have rescued Ace himself. The Whitebeard pirates could have fought and retreated before the Marines' full strength arrived. But Luffy added chaos to the battlefield, drew attention he could not handle, and in the end, did not save his brother, did not save Whitebeard, did not save the allied pirates who died fighting, and did not save the world from the new age of violence that Whitebeard's last words set in motion. This is the arc where a real protagonist becomes the person their story needed them to be. Frodo becomes the ring bearer. Harry becomes the one who walks willingly toward his death. Aang accepts the Avatar state. The protagonist steps up, and the weight of the story finally rests on their shoulders, and they carry it. Luffy does not carry the weight of Marineford. The weight crushes him, and not in a way that makes him stronger in the moment, in a way that leaves him broken on a beach on Amazon Lily, unable to speak, unable to eat, unable to do anything except scream and claw at the grief. His body heals, his heart does not. Jinbei has to sit him down and remind him, gently, that he still has crewmates, that there are people waiting for him, that the world has not ended just because one person is gone. Luffy needs this reminder. He cannot find it himself. He is, in this moment, a 20-year-old boy who has been handed a loss too big for him to carry, and the story lets you see every bit of how he does not carry it. This is the arc where Luffy stops being the hero of his own story for a while. Watch the sequence again with clear eyes. Whitebeard is the hero of Marineford. Whitebeard is the one who gathers the army, leads the charge, sacrifices himself, and dies with words that change the world. Whitebeard is the protagonist of the battle. Luffy is more like a witness whose pain the story cares about very much, but a witness nonetheless. There are brave defenders of Luffy who will say that this is the point, that Marineford is supposed to show Luffy what real weakness is, so that he can come back from it stronger, that the 2-year training period that follows the war is Luffy's real growth moment, that he emerges from Amazon Lily as a different man. Here is the problem with that reading. When Luffy comes back from the time skip, he is effectively the same Luffy. He is physically stronger, he has new moves, he has learned Haki, a new kind of power. But his personality, his judgment, his way of making decisions, his relationship to his own grief, his understanding of the world beyond his circle, all of that is recognizably the same. He does not come back as a man who has been changed by Marineford. He comes back as a man who has been patched up after Marineford. There is a moment in the Wano arc, hundreds of episodes after the war, where Luffy meets a little girl named Otama in a village Ace had once visited. Otama has been waiting years for Ace to come back because Ace promised he would. Luffy tells her almost casually that Ace died 2 years ago. He says it flatly. Otama is furious. She does not know at first that Ace was Luffy's brother because nothing in Luffy's voice or face suggests it. Only later, when someone else explains, does Otama realize that the boy who just delivered that news to her had lost more from Ace's death than she had. That flatness is not growth. That is not a man who has processed his grief and come out the other side at peace. That is a man who has put the grief in a box and chosen never to open it again, because opening it might mean sitting with what his own choices at Impel Down and Marineford cost him and cost the world. And sitting with that kind of weight is, it turns out, the one thing Luffy is not built to do. A protagonist built for the long haul would have had to carry Marineford forever. The loss would have lived in every arc after it. The doubt would have showed up in his choices. The war would have echoed in how he led the crew, how he approached new fights, how he related to people who trusted him with their lives. One Piece mostly does not do this. One Piece puts the war in the rearview mirror, uses it as an emotional flavor whenever it is convenient, and lets Luffy keep charging forward with the exact same cheerful recklessness that got Ace into that situation in the first place. There is something profoundly strange about this. The single most important event in the first half of the series, the event the whole pre-time skip story was building toward, did not rewrite the protagonist. It rewrote the world around him. Whitebeard died, and the seas changed. Ace died, and Sabo eventually inherited his power. The warlord system began to crumble. The Marines restructured. The Revolutionary Army grew stronger. Every character around Luffy was touched by Marineford in a lasting way. Luffy was touched by it for 2 years of training and then basically returned to normal service. And if a protagonist can live through the most important moment of his life and come out the other end the same person he was before it, then you have to ask what the moment was even for. In terms of him, you have to ask whether Marineford was Luffy's story at all, or whether Luffy was simply a rubber boy standing too close to a story that belonged to other people. The more honest answer is the second one. Marineford was Whitebeard's death, Ace's death, and Blackbeard's rise. Luffy was in the frame. Luffy lost someone he loved, but the events of that battle belonged to the men who made the hard choices, and Luffy was not one of them. He was not strong enough to make the hard choices. He was not wise enough. He was not ready. Which raises one of the strangest questions this whole story never quite answers. Because if Luffy was not ready at Marineford, if the arc that was built to be his biggest test became instead the arc that proved he was still a child in over his head, then the place where he went next to finally grow up, the place where the story promised us Luffy would become the pirate he needed to become, was the place that was supposed to fix everything. 2 years on a jungle island with the strongest swordsman in the world's partner, training with the old pirates who had seen it all. 2 years to become a new man. 2 years to earn, finally, the right to be called the protagonist of this story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that place, those 2 years, that island, are worth looking at carefully, because what they actually were and what the fandom remembers them as being are two very different things. Section 6. The Sabaody defeat he never actually learned from. Before the war at Marineford, before the breakout at Impel Down, before Ace was ever captured, there was a single day that, in a different kind of story, would have changed Luffy forever. It happened on Sabaody Archipelago, a strange, beautiful place made of enormous mangrove trees that grew out of the ocean and held whole cities in their roots. The archipelago sits at the halfway point of the Grand Line, right up against the massive wall of the Red Line that splits the world. For the Straw Hats, it was the last island of the first half of their journey. They had crossed oceans to get there. They had beaten gods and ghosts and an Iceman and a Shichibukai and an entire sky kingdom. They thought they were ready for the second half of the Grand Line, the new world, where the real monsters lived. They were not ready. And Sabaody is where the world finally told them so. The trouble started when Luffy, being Luffy, did something that Luffy would always do. In the middle of a slave auction at one of the Grove houses, a world noble named Saint Charlos shot the fishman Hachan for stepping in front of a gunshot meant for a little mermaid named Cammy. The world nobles are the descendants of the families who created the world government. They are treated like gods. Touching one of them, let alone attacking one, is one of the oldest and most unforgivable crimes in this story's world. Attacking a noble brings the Marines down on you with the full force of everything they can throw at a single person. Admirals, ships, fleets, the full weight. Luffy, without hesitating for even a second, walked up to Charlos and punched him in the face, sent him flying through the wall of the auction house. A moment so iconic that it has become one of the defining images of the entire series. The rubber boy who would not bow to a god. The fan base loves this moment, rightly. It is genuinely beautiful as a gesture, but a gesture is not a strategy, and Luffy had just drawn the full force of the world government down on his crew. A fleet was dispatched, an admiral was dispatched, and into the middle of all of this walked Bartholomew Kuma, one of the 7 warlords of the sea, a giant of a man with a Bible and a pair of gloved hands whose power fans still talk about in hushed voices. Kuma's devil fruit allowed him to slap anything, objects, people, even air, away across vast distances, with such force that whatever he slapped would fly for 3 days and 3 nights before landing somewhere on the other side of the world. Kuma approached the Straw Hats calmly. One by one, he hit them. Zoro first, then Brook, then Usopp, then Sanji, then Frankie, then Nami, then Robin, then Chopper. Each of them disappeared in a pop of displaced air, gone to somewhere unknown. Luffy tried to stop him. This is the part that needs to sit with us. Luffy, the captain, the rubber boy who had beaten every enemy the first half of the Grand Line had thrown at him, tried with everything he had to stop Kuma and could not. Every punch Luffy threw missed or was deflected. Every time Luffy tried to reach one of his crewmates before Kuma touched them, he was too slow, too weak, too small. He watched them go, one by one, and could do nothing. The wiki entry for the episode is worth quoting back in its plain description. Luffy began to melt down in sadness over his uselessness and his failure to save his crew. He fell to his knees. He reached out for Robin as Kuma was about to hit her, and missed. Kuma turned to him last. past, told him they would never meet again, and hit him. And Luffy was gone too, flying through the air for 3 days toward an island neither he nor anyone else knew he was headed for. This was the lowest point Luffy had ever been, lower than losing to Crocodile the first time, lower than any beating he had taken up to this point, because Luffy, at his core, defines himself by one thing. He protects his crew. That is his identity. That is what he tells himself. That is what he tells other people. Whenever a villain has threatened one of the Straw Hats in any earlier arc, Luffy has found the strength to answer. It is the thing he does. It is the thing he is. And at Sabaody, the thing he has stopped working. You could not have a cleaner, clearer, more complete destruction of a character's self-image. Luffy's entire sense of who he is rests on the ability to protect the people he loves. Kuma took that ability from him, in public, in front of the crewmates themselves, and the crew watched their captain be helpless. Now here is where the story does something interesting, and where the question about Luffy as a protagonist gets harder, because what should have happened next, from a storytelling point of view, is that Luffy should have been rewritten by this moment. The character that walked off Sabaody should not have been the character who walked on. The certainty should have cracked. The cheerful confidence that throws itself at every fight should have been punctured by the knowledge that it had failed, visibly, in front of the people it was supposed to be protecting. He should have come back from his training period more careful, more thoughtful, more aware that enthusiasm alone is not enough. What happens instead is the 2-year time skip. Luffy is thrown by Kuma to Amazon Lily, the island of warrior women ruled by Boa Hancock. He trains there, then at Rusukaina, under Silver's Rayleigh, the former right hand of the Pirate King himself. He learns hockey, he grows stronger, he picks up new tricks. 2 years pass, he rejoins his crew, and when he comes back, he is essentially the same Luffy. Not in power. In power, he is transformed. Post-time skip Luffy can do things that pre-time skip Luffy could not. He can read people's intentions through observation hockey. He can harden his body through armament hockey. He has developed new gears. He is, in pure combat terms, a different animal. But watch him make decisions in the new world. Watch him walk into situations. Watch how he approaches enemies, how he assesses threats, how he leads his crew. It is the same man. He charges at problems the same way. He picks fights with beings who are clearly far above his level the same way. He ignores warnings from his crew the same way. Even Zoro, normally the one pushing Luffy forward, has moments after the time skip where he has to tell Luffy to take an enemy more seriously. This is remarkable if you think about it. Zoro, the man who lives to fight, is the one asking Luffy to stop casually treating enemies in the new world like they are the weaklings of the East Blue. The most glaring example of this is on Onigashima during the Wano arc. Luffy meets Kaido, the strongest creature in the world, an emperor of the sea, a being whose very name makes other pirates sick to their stomachs. And Luffy, with the same bright confidence he would have brought to a fight against a cartoon villain in the East Blue, throws himself at Kaido. The result is exactly what you would expect. Kaido takes Luffy down in a single punch, a clean, almost bored strike. Luffy is not even part of the conversation. Kaido dismisses him, walks away, and moves on to what he considers the actual threats on the battlefield. This is post-Sabaody Luffy, post-time skip Luffy, post-2 years of training Luffy, acting exactly like a boy who has never lost a fight in his life. He has lost many fights in his life. He lost one so badly on Sabaody that his entire crew was scattered across the world. And somehow, somewhere between that moment and Onigashima, the lesson did not stick. The story itself has noticed this. Writers for major entertainment sites have written pieces over the years making exactly this argument. A piece titled, "Luffy is Regressing as a Character," points out that Luffy's growth in terms of personality has slowed to a crawl, even as the stakes around him have exploded. Another piece on One Piece's plot armor lists fight after fight where Luffy should have died and would have if the story had not intervened to keep him alive. And here is the part that is even stranger. It turns out that a major piece of the time skip story is not even Luffy's doing. Late in the series, a long flashback revealed what Kuma had been thinking during the Sabaody fight. Kuma, as it happens, was not just some passing villain. He was a former member of the Revolutionary Army, a friend of Luffy's father Dragon. He had a daughter named Bonnie. He had been slowly turned into a living weapon for the world government, his memories and personality erased piece by piece until he was little more than a machine. At the time of Sabaody, Kuma still had enough of himself left to make one last choice. He chose to save the Straw Hats. This is the part that rewrites Sabaody in a way most of the fandom does not like to sit with. Kuma did not defeat the Straw Hats at random. Kuma picked the exact destinations each Straw Hat would be sent to. Zoro to Kuragana, the island of the world's strongest swordsman. Sanji to Kamabaka, the island of dance fighters who could teach him things he needed. Usopp to Boyne Archipelago, where he would be forced to grow. Nami to the Sky Island Weatheria. Robin to Tequila Wolf, where the Revolutionary Army could find her. And Luffy to Amazon Lily, where Hancock would eventually lead him to Rayleigh. Kuma planned all of it. Kuma chose to save the Straw Hats even though the world government had ordered him to crush them. He used his last piece of free will to pick the destinations that would let each crewmate grow in the direction they needed, which means the entire training arc, the place where Luffy was supposedly forged into the pirate who would face the new world, was not a choice Luffy made. It was a gift Kuma gave him. Luffy did not seek out Rayleigh. Rayleigh was led to him. Luffy did not plan his growth. His growth was planned by someone else, carried out on an island someone else chose, under the guidance of a teacher someone else arranged. You can read this as a kind thing, a dying man's last gift to a boy he believed was the person who would free the world. And it is, emotionally, a beautiful piece of storytelling. But it does something strange to Luffy's arc if you think about it from the angle of protagonist agency, because what it means is that even the moment in the story where Luffy was supposed to earn his own strength was engineered for him by a third party. The training was a handout, a very well-intentioned one, but a handout. And through all of this, the deepest question about Sabaody goes unanswered. Did Luffy actually learn anything from the day he watched his entire crew get swept away and could not stop it? Look at the evidence. He comes back stronger. Yes. He comes back with new powers. Yes. But does he come back with a new understanding of his own limits? Does he come back with a new respect for enemies he cannot beat?
Does he come back changed in the way a person is changed by watching the people they love get taken and being unable to prevent it? The Kaido fight says no. The way he barrels into fights in the New World says no. The way he underestimates Big Mom on Whole Cake Island says no. The way he refuses to retreat, even when retreating is clearly the smart move, says no. Somewhere on Rusukaina, during those 2 years of training, Luffy learned how to hit harder. He did not learn how to lose. He did not learn how to plan. He did not learn how to assess risk. He did not learn any of the things that Sabaody, if it had been a real character-shaping defeat, should have taught him. The scene where his crew was ripped from him should have haunted him. You can read through every arc after the time skip and not find a single moment where Luffy seems haunted by it. It is in the past. It is done. He will not let it happen again, he tells himself. And the way he has decided not to let it happen again is by becoming stronger. Not by becoming wiser, not by becoming more careful, just stronger. As if strength alone is what failed on Sabaody, and not the assumption that showed up on Sabaody that his strength would always be enough. A protagonist who has been reshaped by defeat walks differently, speaks differently, sees the world differently. A protagonist who is simply trained after defeat walks the same way as before, just with a bigger hammer. Luffy has the bigger hammer. He does not walk differently. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This is a pattern that has become impossible to ignore by the later arcs of the series. And somewhere around the middle of the current saga, something happened that made the pattern feel even stranger. Because after everything the series had built about Luffy being a scrappy underdog who earned his strength through suffering and luck and an impossible refusal to give up, a reveal landed that seemed to rewrite the whole story of where his power had come from in the first place. And if that reveal is taken seriously, and it is hard not to take it seriously when it is delivered by one of the most respected characters in the series, then the whole shape of Luffy as a protagonist might need to be rethought, because the boy we thought we were watching might not have been the boy who was really there the whole time. Section 7. Gear 5 and the Chosen One Problem. For more than 1,000 chapters, one of the quiet, beautiful lies at the heart of One Piece was about what kind of boy Luffy was supposed to be. The lie went like this. Luffy ate a devil fruit when he was 7 years old. The fruit he ate was called the Gum Gum fruit. It was, by the standards of the One Piece world, one of the weakest fruits you could possibly be cursed with. It turned his body into rubber. That was the whole power. He could not breathe fire. He could not produce lightning. He could not shrink the world or move through time. He could stretch. That was it. Every devil fruit user Luffy faced in the early part of the series had powers that were, on paper, better than his. Buggy could split his body into pieces that floated. Smoker could turn into smoke. Crocodile could control sand. Enel could throw lightning. Aokiji could freeze the ocean. Every one of them had a toolset that, by any reasonable measurement, was more useful than being made of rubber. And the magic of early One Piece was that Luffy beat them all anyway. Not because the fruit was secretly strong, because he was creative. He invented new ways to use his rubber body. He came up with Gear Second, where he pumped blood through himself faster to move at incredible speed. He invented Gear Third, where he blew air into his bones to make his body massive. He figured out how to use his rubber limbs to ricochet attacks, to build up spring force, to do things that nobody at the time of his fight with Crocodile in Alabasta would have believed possible. This was the soul of the character. A boy with a weak fruit who beat powerful enemies through effort and imagination. A scrappy underdog who had nothing handed to him except a cursed piece of fruit that everyone thought was a joke. Luffy was special because he made his limits into tools, because he was too stubborn to let a bad fruit stop him. And then in chapter 1044 of the manga, that lie broke. In the middle of the fight with Kaido, the strongest creature in the world, Luffy awakened a new form. He called it Gear Fifth. His hair turned white. His eyes turned black. His body became something that could not really be described in the old rules of the series.
centuries. He could make the ground itself turn to rubber.
He could make his fists the size of mountains. He could stretch lightning. He could, in a stunning moment, turn Kaido's sword into something soft and bouncy for a joke. And Vegapunk, the genius scientist of the One Piece world, explained through his assistant that Luffy's fruit was not actually the gum-gum fruit. The fruit Luffy ate was called the human fruit, model Nika. Nika is a figure from ancient legend, a sun god, a warrior who would one day return to free the oppressed people of the world. His body was made of rubber. He could do anything. He fought with laughter. His very existence was a promise to the enslaved and the hungry that someone would one day come to set them free. The world government had been hunting this fruit for 800 years. They had been so afraid of it that they had renamed it, wiped Nika from history, called the fruit by a false name to hide what it actually was. Luffy was not a boy with a weak fruit who beat the odds.
Luffy was a mythical being whose entire destiny had been written 8 centuries before he was born. Now, let us be honest about what this reveal does to the character. If you were writing a story where the main character rises from nothing through sheer will and imagination, this is not the twist you write. This is the opposite twist. This is the twist that rewrites the first 1,000 chapters of your story so that the main character was never really rising from nothing. He was the chosen one the whole time. He was always going to win because the sun god always wins. Major writers at entertainment sites have written about this, and they have not been gentle. One Piece that ran on a large entertainment site argued directly that Gear 5th undercuts One Piece's central themes. The writer pointed out that what made Luffy iconic in the first place was his ability to earn his victories, battle by battle, against enemies who were stronger than he was on paper. What made fights with enemies like Rob Lucci of CP9 and Katakuri of the Big Mom Pirates work was that Luffy had to climb. He had to invent. He had to bleed. The Gear 5th reveal, the writer argued, destroyed that underdog story by handing Luffy a ready-made god power that came from prophecy rather than effort. And it is hard to argue with this when you look at what Gear 5th actually does in the story. It does not have clear rules. It does not have clear weaknesses. It does not have the careful limits that Luffy's earlier powers had, where you could see what he could and could not do and understand why he was going to win or lose. Gear 5th is basically whatever the scene needs it to be. Luffy's imagination becomes his weapon. He can stretch the sky. He can become as big as a giant. He can bounce off the clouds. He can make his opponent's punches flop and wobble. This is cartoon logic, and many fans find it delightful. It is fun to watch. The animation of the Gear 5th sequences is beautiful. The sense of play is real, but there is a cost to handing your protagonist a power with no limits. The cost is that you can no longer tell a story about whether he will win the next fight. Of course he will win. He is the sun god. The sun god always wins. And it gets stranger, because the Gear 5th reveal changed how other moments in the series read on a second viewing. Remember Sabaody, where Kuma chose to save the Straw Hats and send each of them to a destination that would help them grow? A later flashback revealed that one of the reasons Kuma specifically saved Luffy, rather than just following orders and capturing him, was that Kuma had figured out that Luffy was Nika. Kuma did not save Luffy because Luffy was a scrappy underdog who deserved a chance. Kuma saved Luffy because Kuma had come to believe that this boy was the savior the ancient legends had been promising for 800 years. The training arc, the growth, the survival, the 2 years on Rusukaina, all of it was granted to Luffy at least in part because a dying man believed he was the sun god in human form. This means that by the time you look back at the whole story from where it stands now, you can trace a thread of destiny running through moments that used to feel like luck. Shanks saw something in Luffy as a child and gave him the straw hat. Rayleigh, the Pirate King's right hand, was waiting at Amazon Lily when Luffy arrived. Kuma arranged the time skip. The fruit Luffy ate as a child was not just any fruit. It was the fruit that had been hidden from humanity for 800 years, and it somehow ended up in Shanks's cargo, and somehow ended up in a box on a bar counter in a small village, and somehow ended up being eaten by a 7-year-old, who was the only person on Earth whose arrival the prophecy had been waiting for. You can call this destiny. You can call this fate. You can call it the beautiful intervention of a sun god who knew where he was going. What you cannot call it, with a straight face, is a self-made hero. Compare this to the story most fans used to tell about Luffy. The story was that he was a boy who had nothing going for him except stubbornness and a cheerful heart, and who climbed his way to the top of the pirate world through pure effort. That story was what made One Piece feel different from other shonen series. Goku was raised by a legendary Saiyan who gave him godly genes. Naruto was the secret child of 2 of the strongest ninjas of his generation. Ichigo was secretly descended from a long line of powerful warriors. Luffy was supposed to be the exception. Luffy was the boy with nothing, the rubber boy, the one who got his strength from refusing to quit, not from bloodlines or prophecy. That was the part that made him feel fresh, even when so much else about the character was standard. Gear 5th rewrote that. Luffy is now the one with the most loaded backstory of any of them. Not just a gifted warrior, not just a legendary father, an actual mythical mythological being whose return the world has been waiting for since before the Void Century. A power system that operates on imagination rather than rules. A destiny written into the fruit itself.
And the uncomfortable question this raises is the question you have to sit with, slowly, for a long time. If Luffy was always Nika, then was anything he did before the reveal really his? The first 1,000 chapters were not about a boy with a weak fruit. They were about the sun god, hidden from even himself, slowly awakening into what he had always been. The fights were not really underdog fights. They were early stretches of the god learning to use his body. The victories were not really earned by grit alone. They were the unfolding of a prophecy that was always going to unfold.
That is not a hero's journey in the old sense. That is a chosen one story. And chosen one stories, whatever else you can say about them, do not require the main character to grow. The main character is already what they need to be. They just have to discover it, which is a deeply strange story to tell about a character whose appeal was that he was not any of that. The writers who love this reveal say it is beautiful because it connects Luffy to the oldest mysteries of the world. The writers who hate it say it cheapens every fight that came before it. Both readings have their truth, but whichever side of that debate you sit on, one thing is very hard to deny. The Luffy we thought we had been watching for 25 years was partly a mirage. The real Luffy was always a figure of legend. Everything else was the slow removal of the disguise. And a legend, by definition, is not a person. A legend is a shape people project onto the world. The real Luffy, the one underneath the Gear 5th glow and the prophecy and the 800-year-old promise, has to live somewhere. He has to have an inner life. He has to have thoughts he does not say out loud, wounds he has not healed, feelings about the people he has lost that shape how he moves through the world. __quote_6___. Except when you go looking for that inner life, for that private Luffy underneath the cheerful shell, for the man who has been carrying all of this for all of these years, you run into something quiet and strange and a little bit heartbreaking, because the inner life is hard to find. The private feelings are not really there on the page. The wounds, the ones that should have stayed with him after Marineford, after Sabaody, after everything he lost, they appear only when someone else puts them in his hands. Section 8. The emotional intelligence that isn't there. There is a version of Luffy that fans love to talk about, and it is the version that sees through people. The Luffy who knows, just by looking at a stranger, whether they are kind or cruel. The Luffy who can feel when a crewmate is hurting, even when they have not said a word. The Luffy who puts his straw hat on Nami's head and walks toward her enemy without needing her to explain anything. That version is real. It lives in the show. It is one of the reasons so many people love him. But there is another side to this, and it is the side that gets quiet once you look for it. Luffy can read other people. He cannot read himself. He notices pain in other people almost perfectly. He notices pain in himself almost never. He knows when Nami is suffering, when Robin is suffering, when Chopper is suffering, when a stranger 3 minutes into meeting him has something heavy they are not saying. But ask him what he is feeling on the inside, about his own losses, about his own fears, about his own grief, and the answer is almost always the same. He does not know. He has not thought about it. He is not going to think about it now. This is the part of the character that is the hardest to write about, because it is not a flashy failure. It is not a prison break or a lost war. It is a quiet absence, a thing that should be there and is not. The clearest place to see it is around the death of Ace. Ace was, to Luffy, not just a brother. Ace was one of the 3 people who had raised Luffy after he was left alone in the mountains. Ace had watched over him, protected him, bullied him, loved him, shared food with him. Ace had been the older figure who told Luffy that being alive was okay, even when the world felt like it was not. And when Ace died in Luffy's arms at Marineford, Luffy broke. This is where the show's version of emotional honesty is at its best. Luffy cannot speak. He cannot breathe. His body reacts to the loss the way a body reacts to a physical wound. He collapses. He screams. He goes into a coma of grief. And when he wakes up on Amazon Lily, he cannot believe it is real. He tries to tell himself it was a nightmare. He tears at his own chest. He lashes out at the people around him. He is completely lost. And then Jinbei, the wise former warlord who had fought alongside him at Marineford, holds him down. Jinbei tells him, carefully and without cruelty, to remember what he still has. That Ace is gone. That Whitebeard is gone. That many people are gone. But that his crew is alive, and they are waiting for him. And he has people who love him who still need him. Luffy hears this, and slowly, painfully, comes back to himself. He rings the bell at Marineford as a signal to his crew. He plans for the 2-year training period. He starts walking forward again. This sequence is beautifully drawn and beautifully written. It is one of the emotional peaks of the entire series, but watch what happened in it carefully, because what happened is important. Luffy did not process his grief. Jinbei did. Jinbei gave Luffy the frame. Jinbei gave Luffy the reason to keep going. Luffy accepted it because Jinbei handed it to him. If Jinbei had not been there, if Luffy had been left alone on that beach, we have no reason to believe he would have figured out any of this on his own.
down. He would have screamed and torn at himself until his body gave out. He does not have the inner tools to talk himself through a loss like this. This is not necessarily a criticism of the character. Many real people are like this. Many real people need other people to help them understand their own pain. Grief is hard. Nobody handles it alone well. But it is a criticism of the character if you are trying to call him a protagonist in the classic sense. Because the classic protagonist is someone who, when the worst thing happens to them, goes inward. They sit with the pain. They turn it over in their hands. They come out the other side of it changed because the pain has taught them something they did not know before. This is the pattern in almost every story we call great. The hero takes the blow, disappears into their own mind for a while, and returns different. Luffy does not go inward. Luffy goes outward. Luffy needs someone else to be the inside for him. This would still be fine, maybe even beautiful, if the grief then stayed with him. If Luffy, after Jinbei's speech, carried Ace forward as a weight he would always feel. If the loss kept living in his voice, in his face, in the way he reached for things, that would be a man who had been rewritten by grief, even if he needed help to begin the rewriting. But the grief does not stay. Not in any visible way. Watch Luffy after the time skip. Watch him move through the New World, through Punk Hazard, through Dressrosa, through Zou, through Whole Cake Island, through Wano. Count the times Luffy himself, without being prompted by someone else, brings up Ace. Count the times he thinks about his brother out loud. Count the times he carries Ace into a conversation that was not already about Ace. The number is not 0, but it is close to it. When Ace comes up, it is almost always because someone else brought him up first. Sabo reappears and reminds Luffy that Ace's fire can live on through him. Luffy cries and then moves on. Yamato, on Onigashima, turns out to have been a friend of Ace's and kept his Vivre card, watching it burn out as Ace died. Luffy listens to this and says a few kind words and moves on. The most chilling moment comes in the Wano arc, with the little girl named Otama. Otama is a small child. She was raised in a starving, impoverished village under the tyranny of Kaido. Years before the Straw Hats arrived, Ace had passed through her village and shown her kindness. Ace had promised her he would come back. Otama has been waiting for him ever since. She has been holding that promise the way only a child holds a promise from a person they have chosen to trust. Luffy, on meeting her, finds out that she is still waiting for Ace, and he tells her, flatly, that Ace died 2 years ago. The flatness is the thing that should stop you. Otama hears this and becomes furious at Luffy. She does not know at first that Ace was Luffy's brother. Nothing in the way Luffy delivered the news told her so. Nothing in his face, nothing in his voice. A child who had spent years holding on to a promise had that promise broken in a tone that sounded like someone reading a weather report. It was only when Nami later explained to her that Ace and Luffy had been brothers that Otama understood and felt terrible for her anger. This scene is small. It flashes by in the middle of a much larger arc, but it is one of the most telling moments in the whole post-time skip Luffy story. A man who was truly carrying the loss of Ace with him, who felt it every day, could not have said what Luffy said in the way Luffy said it. Ace's name would have stopped his voice. His face would have shown something. Instead, he delivered the news like a fact about the weather and moved on to ask about food. This is not a hero who has processed grief. This is a hero who has boxed the grief up and put it somewhere inside himself where it cannot reach him. The container holds. The contents do not leak. And when you look at a scene like this, you realize that Luffy has spent the entire post-time skip era this way. The grief for Ace is there, absolutely. It is real, but it is sealed. It does not move. It does not shape him. It does not live in his daily face. And this is the quiet trouble with Luffy as a protagonist. Because a character who cannot process their own pain, who needs other people to do the processing for them, who seals off their losses rather than sitting with them, that is a character who cannot be reshaped by what happens to them. Which brings us right back to the first problem. A character who cannot be reshaped does not grow. A character who does not grow is not doing the main job of a main character. There is a beautiful piece of fan writing that went around a while back about Luffy's hidden pain. The writer argued that everything Luffy is, all his loyalty and his fire and his refusal to lose anyone, comes from the abandonment he felt as a child. Dropped by his father before he could remember, separated from his mother, left in the mountains with bandits, losing Sabo when he was 7, losing Ace when he was 17. That is, the writer argued, an enormous pile of loss for one young person to carry, and all of Luffy's bright, loud, cheerful energy is a kind of scar tissue over it. This reading is generous and probably true, but notice what it requires. It requires the reader to find the pain for Luffy, because Luffy will not find it for himself. It requires us to write the inner life of the character into him, because the story is not giving that inner life to us directly. Luffy does not sit in his room on the Thousand Sunny at night and look at the sea and think about Ace. Luffy does not have quiet moments with Nami where he talks about what he lost. Luffy does not tell Zoro that he is afraid of losing any of them. The things we believe about his inner world are things we are inferring. The show is not showing us the inside of him. It is showing us the outside and trusting us
to imagine an inside that matches, and many fans do imagine it, and many of those imaginings are probably close to correct. But imagining the inner life of a protagonist is something the reader should not be required to do. The protagonist should be living that inner life on the page. The protagonist should be dropping their face, sometimes, when nobody is supposed to be looking. The protagonist should be letting the grief leak, not containing it. A real protagonist of a long series is changed by their losses, because the losses become part of how they see the world. Luffy does not seem to see the world differently after losing Ace. He sees the world the same way he saw it before.
He is still chasing the same dream, laughing at the same jokes, eating the same meat, charging at the same enemies with the same certainty. The ace-shaped hole in him exists, but it is buried so deep that it does not reach his eyes. This is, in its own strange way, a kind of survival strategy for a character who has lost too much. It might even be a mercy the story is giving him. If Luffy truly had to feel, every day, the weight of everyone he has loved and lost, he might not be able to function. So the story protects him by not making him feel it. But the cost of that protection is that Luffy cannot carry the emotional weight of his own story. He is not the heart of One Piece. He is the smiling mouth of it. The heart lives somewhere else, in the crew around him, in the people who feel things for him when he cannot feel them for himself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and that is a quiet truth about this series. The emotional center of One Piece is not Luffy. It never really has been. It has been the ensemble around him, each one carrying a piece of the inner life the main character does not seem to have. And if you pull back far enough and look at how One Piece is actually built, arc by arc, island by island, villain by villain, a pattern starts to form, and it starts to tell you something strange about the story itself. Something that has nothing to do with Luffy's emotions and everything to do with the shape the writers have been forced to choose because of who their protagonist really is. Section 9. The repetition problem, and why it's Luffy's fault. One of the oldest complaints about One Piece, from readers who love it and from readers who do not, is that the story keeps telling the same story. The Straw Hats arrive at a new island. The island is being ruled by a cruel tyrant. The tyrant has made the lives of the ordinary people on the island unbearable. One of those ordinary people crosses paths with the Straw Hats, and their suffering touches one of the crew, usually in a personal way. Luffy decides the tyrant must fall. He fights his way through the tyrant's servants. His crewmates fight their own smaller battles along the way, each one testing one crew member against a villain who is designed to push them. Eventually, Luffy reaches the tyrant at the top of the tower, or the deepest room of the castle, or the center of the fortress. They fight. Luffy loses the first round. Luffy digs deep, finds new strength, and wins the second round. The island is freed. The people cheer. The Straw Hats eat a big meal and sail away. This is a frame you can place, with only small adjustments, over Arlong Park, over Alabasta, over Skypiea, over Thriller Bark, over Fishman Island, over Dressrosa, over Whole Cake Island, over Wano, over arc after arc after arc. The names change. The look of the island changes. The tyrant changes. The style of the fight changes. But the shape underneath stays the same. Major entertainment writers have pointed this out for years. One published piece put it directly and sharply. Every island is like Alabasta. The writer argued that One Piece is famous for its inventive storytelling. But the closer you look, the more you see the same skeleton under every new costume. For many fans, this is fine. They like the skeleton. They like knowing, more or less, what shape an arc is going to take. They show up for the new characters, the new setting, the new villain, the new emotional beats. They do not mind that the underlying rhythm is the same, because the variations keep the rhythm from feeling tired. But there is a question that this criticism rarely goes far enough to ask. Why is the story shaped this way? Why, out of all the ways Ichiro Oda could have built his massive pirate epic, did he end up with a formula where every island is a miniature liberation? The answer lives in the main character. A story's shape is decided, more than most fans realize, by the nature of its protagonist. A curious protagonist gives you a detective story. A haunted protagonist gives you a mystery. A protagonist with a clear, focused goal gives you a quest. And a protagonist who only acts when he sees somebody he cares about being hurt gives you, almost by force, a story of small liberations. One island at a time. One friend at a time. One tyrant at a time. Go back to the previous sections. We already saw that Luffy does not drive the plot. He reacts to it. We already saw that Luffy's moral world is made of attachments, not principles. We already saw that Luffy does not act unless a person he has come to love is in danger. Now take those observations and ask yourself what a writer has to do if their main character is like this and they still need to keep the story moving. They have to keep putting people Luffy can love in situations of terrible suffering, because those are the only situations Luffy will act in. This is not a theory. It is a structural necessity. Imagine for a moment an island where the Straw Hats arrive and everyone is fine. The leadership is reasonable. The economy is healthy. The locals are happy. A Straw Hat walks into town
and buys a melon for a fair price and sits on a bench in the sun and eats it and leaves. What is the arc? There is no arc, because nothing is wrong, because there is no crying friend, because there is no tyrant choking the life out of someone Luffy would care about, because the story has not placed a piece of suffering in the Straw Hat's way, and without that piece of suffering, Luffy has no reason to do anything at all. So the island has to be cruel. The ruler has to be evil. Somebody has to be crying. Somebody has to become Luffy's friend. The friend's pain has to be a pain Luffy can fight, and the resolution has to be that Luffy fights the thing causing the pain and wins. This is the whole engine of One Piece, and it only exists in this shape because Luffy is the main character. Compare this to a story with a different kind of protagonist. In Attack on Titan, the protagonist Eren Yeager wants to find out what is in a basement, and that specific want drives the story into strange, unexpected shapes. Arc after arc is about different pieces of a puzzle that Eren himself is chasing. The arcs do not all look the same because Eren's goal pulls him through different kinds of territory. Political arcs, military arcs, mystery arcs, horror arcs. The shape of each one comes from the shape of Eren's pursuit. In Full Metal Alchemist, Edward Elric is traveling to find a stone that can restore his brother's body. That goal pulls him into arcs that involve politics, religion, war crimes, and the science of alchemy itself. Each arc is different because Edward's search runs into different kinds of obstacles, and each obstacle creates a different kind of story. In One Piece, the goal is to find the One Piece, but Luffy is not really searching for it. The One Piece comes to him through the natural drift of the Grand Line. So the arcs cannot be built around his search. They have to be built around what he will react to. And the thing he reacts to is the pain of people he has come to love, which means every arc needs one of those people in pain, which means every arc has to have a tyrant causing that pain, which means every arc has to end with Luffy freeing an island, because that is the only ending that matches the emotional structure of how the arc started. The formula is the protagonist's shadow. Change the protagonist, change the shape of every arc. Keep the protagonist, and you are locked into the shape forever. A respected writer at a major entertainment site made this exact point a while back, though not in these words. The writer argued that One Piece's over-reliance on Luffy always having to be at the center of every single thing makes the storytelling repetitive. The writer specifically pointed out that arcs that had been set up to focus on other characters, like Wano, where Zoro's history with the land was a huge part of the setup, ended up getting pulled back toward Luffy's fight with Kaido anyway. The beating heart of each arc could have been another character's journey, but because Luffy is the main character, and because Luffy is the one the audience has to see win the last fight, the arc has to bend its ending toward him. This is the price the story pays for its protagonist. The ensemble, which is one of the great achievements of One Piece, keeps getting nudged into the supporting role every single time. And it is worth sitting with the shape of this for a moment, because it tells us something important about what is actually happening in this series. Zoro, the swordsman, has his own dream, to become the greatest swordsman in the world. He trains, he grows, he fights, but his dream has to wait until Luffy's fight is done, on almost every island. Sanji, the cook, has his own dream, to find the All Blue, a mythical sea where all fish can be found. His dream is a footnote in arc after arc. Nami dreams of mapping the whole world. Usopp dreams of becoming a brave warrior of the sea. Chopper dreams of being a doctor who can cure any disease. Robin dreams of learning the true history of the world that the world government has spent centuries erasing. Frankie dreams of building a ship that can sail to the end of the Grand Line. Brook dreams of reuniting with his old friend, a whale named Laboon. Every one of these dreams belongs to a character far more specific and far more internal than Luffy's. Every one of these characters has an inner life, a past, a real set of wants and losses. And every one of these dreams has to take a back seat, arc after arc, to Luffy's need to free an island and beat its tyrant. This is not an accident. This is the structural cost of having a protagonist who operates the way Luffy operates. If he were a different kind of character, a character whose own goals and doubts generated plot, then the arcs could belong to different characters at different times. Wano could have been Zoro's arc. Fishman Island could have been Jinbei's arc. Enies Lobby, arguably, was Robin's arc, and the moment Robin screams that she wants to live is the best moment in the entire arc. But even that moment is followed by Luffy's fight with Rob Lucci, which the story insists has to be the climax. Robin's cry is the heart. Luffy's punch is the ending. And the story always treats the ending as the point. This is why so many fans' favorite character is not Luffy. It is Zoro, or Sanji, or Robin, or Law, or Shanks, or Mihawk. These characters have inner lives the story lets them keep. They get to be specific. They get to want particular things for particular reasons. They get to change. Luffy, pinned at the center of every arc by the structural need for a hero to beat the final boss, cannot afford to be specific, because if he were too specific, he could not also be the universal liberator every arc needs him to be. So Luffy is kept general. A bright grin, a rubber arm, a big appetite, appetite, a love of his crew. And around him, the real characters, the ones with inner lives, do their quieter, richer, more interesting work. And this is the thing that is hard to say but true. One Piece is an ensemble story that pretends to be a main character story, because it has to. Every arc is an ensemble piece whose ending is forced to feature a single person's fight because the formula demands it. The story is constantly fighting against its own protagonist to be what it actually is, which is a story about a group of broken, beautiful people who found each other and are trying to chase their dreams together. This is why One Piece works. Not because Luffy is a great protagonist, because the crew is so good that the story survives its protagonist. Every fan who has ever said that Zoro is their favorite, or Sanji is their favorite, or Robin is their favorite, is quietly telling you something about where the real weight of the series sits. The real weight sits with the supporting cast. Luffy is the flag the story flies. The ship underneath the flag is built by everyone else. And this leaves us with one last question. The biggest one. The one that has been sitting in the background of every section of this essay. Because if Luffy fails almost every test of being a classic protagonist, and if the story around him carries most of the emotional and narrative weight, and if the arcs are shaped by his needs rather than driven by them, and if the reveal at Gear 5th rewrote his whole backstory into destiny rather than struggle, then how, in the name of every pirate who ever sailed, did One Piece become the best-selling comic in the history of the medium? How did this story, with this protagonist, become the most beloved manga on Earth? Because that cannot be a mistake. A mistake does not sell 500 million copies. __quote _8 ___. So the real question, the one the last section of this essay has to answer, is this one. If Luffy is this bad at being a protagonist, then what is he doing right? And what does that tell us about what a protagonist actually is? Section 10. Why it works anyway, and what this tells us about protagonists. Let us sit with the numbers for a moment, because the numbers are the part of this story that the whole essay has to reckon with in the end. One Piece has sold more than 500 million copies. It is the best-selling comic series in the history of the medium, in any country, in any language. It has outsold Batman. It has outsold Superman. It has outsold Spider-Man. It has outsold every superhero story, and every fantasy story, and every war story, and every romance story ever put on a printed page. For more than 25 years, it has been published without missing its rhythm. The anime has passed 1,100 episodes and is still going. The 2023 live-action adaptation on a major streaming service broke records. The show is not a cult favorite. It is one of the most popular stories currently being told to humans anywhere on Earth. And the protagonist of this story is a rubber boy who does not drive the plot, does not grow over time, does not process his own grief, has a moral world shaped entirely by personal attachments, caused one of the biggest disasters in his world on purpose, failed the most important test of his life, had his whole backstory rewritten into prophecy, and whose presence forces the writer into the same arc shape on every single island. These two facts have to live in the same head at the same time, and the job of this final section is to explain how they can. The explanation, once you are ready to accept it, is strange and a little bit humbling. It means rethinking what a protagonist is actually for. The old definition, the one we have been measuring Luffy against all essay long, says that a protagonist is the person whose choices drive the story, whose growth is the story, whose inner life is the story. Under that definition, Luffy fails hard. He is not driving. He is not growing. His inner life is sealed. But there is another kind of protagonist. Not better, not worse, just different. And it turns out that Luffy is a near perfect example of this other kind. The other kind of protagonist is not the person who changes over the course of the story. The other kind of protagonist is the person who does not change, so that everyone else can change around them. A steady flame, a fixed star, a constant thing that the shifting world can be measured against. Think about what a flame actually does. A flame does not grow. A flame does not have an arc. A flame does not process its feelings. A flame burns, and burns the same way it has always burned. And in burning, it lets the people around it see things they could not see before. It lets them warm themselves. It lets them cook. It lets them stay together in the dark. Luffy is that flame. Watch what happens to every single Straw Hat after they meet him. Nami was a thief trapped in her own rage, serving an enemy she hated, unable to see a way out. She met Luffy. She is now a free woman, sailing toward her dream of mapping the world, loved by a family she chose. Zoro was a directionless young swordsman, chasing a rival he had not seen in years, with a promise to a dead friend and no real way to keep it. He met Luffy. He is now on track to become the greatest swordsman in the world, with the world's current strongest swordsman as his teacher, his promise still alive. Sanji was a cook on a floating restaurant with a dream of finding a sea he was not even sure existed, quietly dying of the weight of never leaving the place that had saved him. He met Luffy. He is now sailing toward the All Blue with people who love him enough to cross the planet for him. Usopp, Chopper, Robin, Frankie, Brook, Jinbei, every single one of them. Go down the list and what you find is the the same pattern. Every Straw Hat was stuck before Luffy. Every Straw Hat was carrying a dream they had stopped believing in. Every Straw Hat had accepted, quietly or loudly, that their life was going to be smaller than they wanted it to be. And then Luffy walked in, and Luffy did not change, and Luffy did not grow, and Luffy did not become something new. Luffy just kept being Luffy, and that constancy, that unchanging cheerful refusal to accept that anything is impossible, dragged every single one of them back to the dream they had abandoned. This is what a steady flame does. It does not grow. It lets everyone around it grow by burning the same way it has always burned. And this is the definition of protagonist that actually matches what Luffy is. He is not the one who changes. He is the reason other people change. He is not the one who has an inner arc. He is the character whose presence makes everyone else have inner arcs. He is not the story's journey. He is the road the story's journeys are walked upon. Under this reading, every flaw in Luffy we have spent 9 sections cataloging is not a flaw. It is the point. His unchangingness is the point. His reactivity is the point. His moral world made only of attachments is the point. Because if his moral world were made of abstract principles instead, he could not love each Straw Hat the specific, personal way each of them needs to be loved in order to heal. His inability to process his own grief is the point. Because if he could process grief alone, he would not need the crew, and the crew is the whole thing the story is about. Luffy is not the hero of One Piece. The crew is the hero of One Piece. Luffy is what makes the crew possible. This does not excuse the problems we named. Impel Down still happened. The prisoners Luffy set loose on the world still did the terrible things they did. The Blackbeard pirates are still partly his responsibility. Marineford still ended the way it ended. The repetitive arc structure is still real. The Gear 5th retcon still rewrote his backstory into prophecy. These problems are still problems. We are not erasing them. We are saying that the story survived them because the story was never actually about Luffy in the first place. This is the deep trick of One Piece. It looks like a story about a rubber boy who wants to be pirate king. It is, underneath, a story about 9 broken people who find each other on a ship and slowly help each other become the people they had always wanted to be. The rubber boy is the shape the story uses to bring them together and keep them together. He is not the reason the story is good. He is the reason the story can exist at all. And here is the part that is worth saying carefully, because it is the part that makes this whole essay land the way a long essay is supposed to land. Once you accept that Luffy is this kind of protagonist, you start to notice something about other famous stories too. The pattern starts showing up everywhere. Frodo, in Lord of the Rings, is often criticized for being passive. He does not really do much, other than keep walking toward Mount Doom. Sam is the one who carries him. Sam is the one with the speeches. Sam is the one who grows. Frodo, by the end, is so broken that he cannot even live in the Shire anymore. He has to sail away. Because Frodo was never meant to be the active hero. Frodo was the vessel for the ring, the steady thing that the story could hang itself on, so that everyone else around him could become what they were meant to be. Sam goes home. Aragorn becomes king. Merry and Pippin become the 2 respected hobbits of their village. Frodo is the reason all of this happens. He does not really get an arc of his own in the way we usually mean the word. He is the flame. Goku, in Dragon Ball, is often criticized in exactly the same ways Luffy is. He does not really grow. He does not really change. He is a cheerful fighter in the first chapter, and he is a cheerful fighter in the last one. What changes around him is everything. Piccolo, his former enemy, becomes a surrogate father to his son. Vegeta, his other former enemy, becomes a family man who fights alongside him. Krillin finds love. Gohan becomes a scholar. The world changes shape over and over because Goku keeps being Goku. These are the biggest stories in their respective countries, maybe in the world, and their protagonists, on the surface, fail the same tests Luffy fails. But they succeed at something the tests do not measure. They hold still, while the world around them becomes something new. This is a kind of storytelling. It is an old kind. It goes back further than the modern idea of character growth. In old myths and folktales, heroes rarely had arcs. They had natures. Odysseus was clever. Hercules was strong. King Arthur was kind. They did not grow into these things. They were these things, from the beginning to the end, and the stories happened around their unchanging centers. The arcs belonged to the people who met them, to Penelope, to the lions Hercules fought, to the knights of the Round Table. The hero was the weight at the center of the wheel. The wheel turned around the hero. Modern storytelling, for the most part, has moved away from this. We want our heroes to grow now. We want to see them changed. We want a journey, not a statue. And for most modern stories, this is the right instinct. A modern novel about a person who does not change is usually a novel about a person who refuses to grow up. And that refusal is the point. But One Piece is not really a modern story. It is, in many ways, a folktale dressed up as a serialized manga. It is a story about a boy who has a nature and sails through a world and leaves changes behind him wherever he goes. It is a story that works by the old rules, even though it is being published inside the new ones. And by the old rules, Luffy is exactly what a protagonist is supposed to be. So when we say, as the title of this essay says, that Luffy is a terrible protagonist, we have to be careful about what we mean by terrible.
By modern standards, by the checklist of things a main character is supposed to do in a serialized narrative, he fails. That is the first 9 sections of this essay, and every one of those failures is real. But by the older, stranger, more mythical standards, the standards that make folktales and hero legends work the way they work, Luffy is something very close to perfect. He is the unchanging boy at the center of a turning world. He is the reason the world can turn. And the truth, the honest truth, is that both of these things are real at the same time. Luffy is a bad protagonist by modern standards. One Piece is a great story anyway. The contradiction is not really a contradiction. It is 2 different ways of measuring the same thing, and the story is using the older way while most of us have been measuring it with the newer one. If you read One Piece expecting a modern character journey, you are going to spend 25 years frustrated. You are going to wonder why the main character never changes. You are going to wonder why the arcs all feel the same. You are going to wonder why the emotional weight never quite lands where you expect it to land. If you read One Piece the way it actually wants to be read, as a modern folk tale with a mythical protagonist at its center and an ensemble of real, growing, hurting, dreaming people around him, the thing opens up. The repetition becomes a drumbeat. The arcs become verses. The crew becomes the melody. And Luffy, the unchanging rubber boy, becomes what he was always meant to be. The rhythm, the heartbeat, the steady thing underneath everything. This does not mean the criticisms in this essay were wrong. Every one of them stands. Impel Down was a catastrophe he caused. Marineford was his biggest failure. The repetition is real. The Gear 5th retcon is real. The missing inner life is real. These are not imaginary problems. They are the price the story pays for having a protagonist of this kind. But the story pays the price willingly, because the protagonist of this kind is the only one who could hold a crew of 9 broken souls together for 1,000 chapters and make their dreams seem reachable. A protagonist with an inner arc would have collapsed under his own weight 100 arcs ago. A protagonist with more self-awareness would have stopped and gotten quiet and not dragged anyone forward. A protagonist with a properly processed grief for Ace would have sunk into the pain and never come out. Luffy does not do any of these things. Luffy keeps burning, and in the light of his burning, 8 other people find their way to who they were supposed to be. So here is the final shape of it. Luffy is a terrible protagonist of a great story, and the story is great partly because its protagonist is terrible in exactly the ways he is terrible. Fix him, and you lose the thing that makes the rest of the crew bloom. Keep him, and you accept every one of the costs this essay has walked you through. Oda chose to keep him. The world has rewarded that choice 500 million times, which is its own kind of answer to the question this essay started with. It turns out that a protagonist does not have to do all the things we usually ask protagonists to do. A protagonist just has to be the thing a story needs at its center. Sometimes that is a person who changes. Sometimes that is a person who cannot. Luffy cannot. That is his gift. And that is why he is, in the strangest and most honest sense, the best worst protagonist in the history of the medium. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.